Hello and welcome back to Inside Update, a show brought to you by InsideInvestigator.org, where we create investigative journalism to root out corruption in Connecticut. My name is Connor Dragotis, and today I am joined by Brandon Whiting and Catherine Revelo to discuss their newest investigation, Partial Record, Sexual Misconduct and Transparency at CSCU. We have a disclaimer at the beginning of this investigation on the website, and I think it's worth mentioning here as well that we are talking about sexual misconduct in higher education. And while I don't expect that we will get into the sometimes gruesome and upsetting details of these cases on this show, it's worth mentioning that this is a sensitive topic, and I guess maybe that is the best place to start. This is a tough one for a lot of reasons. There was also a lot of difficulty in even getting this information in the first place. We have been writing about sexual misconduct and some of the troubles with accountability in higher education since 2022 when we launched. But this investigation came out of a FOIA request we submitted almost a year and a half ago. And it is only now, so much later, that we have received documentation enough to start putting out information to the public. And in the meantime, we've seen additional misconduct happen. We know that there have continued to be problems. And let's start with Catherine, just our resident expert on transparency and some of the problems that we know exist. Catherine, lead us off here.
Right. I mean, I think, the highlight here, Connor, is what you just said, is 17 months, right? An inside investigator is what, just under 3 years old? So, like, more than half of the time that we've been publishing, we've been waiting for these documents to come back to us. Right. Obviously, this request included CCSU, which is what the bulk of the story was about because they're the only ones who've gotten back to us with documents, but also included UConn and the Coast Guard Academy, from whom we've received nothing, Connor, right? Not even, follow-ups to questions about like, hey, we've been waiting for 17 months. What's going on with this request? Um, and, as we detail in the story, we have gotten some documents back from this. We've gotten investigation reports into these cases of alleged sexual misconduct. But in many cases, they're incomplete. There are attachments to investigation reports that are missing, which should be covered by the language of the request. There's also a number of cases where there are improper redactions, which again, we haven't gotten any follow-up to when we've asked questions about, hey, what's going on here? We think that this is improper. Again, we haven't received any communication. And this is a FOIA issue, but it's also a FERPA issue, which is a federal law that protects educational records. And it has frequently been abused, specifically in cases where, especially people like student journalists have tried to uncover these kinds of things that are going on campuses and are being covered up, and there are some pretty egregious examples of this in here. They, under the FOIA exemption that incorporates FERPA in Connecticut, they redacted the name of a student newspaper, which is not an educational record. So there is absolutely zero reason to try to apply that. It's also public information. If we can go online and Google something, that's not something that is exempt from public disclosure. They exempted the name of a sports team that one of these individuals who is accused was the coach of. Again, public information, also not applicable to the FERPA exemption. And so, I think that's a huge frustration with this story because transparency is about making sure that these stories are told. FOIA is supposed to be a transparency tool. So, it's pretty critical to telling these stories. But, this isn't the first time that we've discussed, sexual misconduct here. We've been on this show before to talk about, stories that have gone on at UConn. And, the question of when we are not getting responses from these universities for things that we know are going on because they're being publicly reported, when is this news? When do we report on it? And that's a decision that we've had to make here. Even though the story is incomplete because we don't have all of these documents, we can't just sit here and let this go unreported because we know it's going on. And it doesn't do a service to anyone to just let these universities continue to abuse FOIA and not comply with FOIA, to avoid accountability.
I don't think that there was any way around it at this point. I mean, we have had to move forward with a challenge with the Freedom of Information Commission at this point, with UConn and with CSCU, just to, I don't know, inspire them to give us the documents. I mean, one of the things that stood out to me through this process, we sat down, we received an initial data dump of a few documents, and then we reached back out and said, hey, here are a number of documents that don't seem to be here, like categorically. You don't seem to have included certain kinds of records that we requested. And they did get back to us and they said, hey, here are a few more documents. I think we ended up with 44 documents on 18 different cases. And even then, we have an email out, and again, leading to this FOIC challenge that said, here is another list of documents that you actually reference in what you have provided that we know exist because you're talking about them and using them to make these determinations, but they have not been given to us. What's going on? And that's where the communication just stopped. And I think that's one of the weirdest parts about this whole thing is that it's emails back and forth, it's clarifications, it's questions. And then as soon as we get to a point, it's radio silence. And, I know, Brandon, you kind of stood out here in this process as we got, the writing process. I don't think we'll get into that, but we got some of the draft material back. And all of a sudden we realized you got someone on the record to talk about the process, which I don't think Catherine and I expected to be possible. But you actually did get someone to comment about some of the issues that they were experiencing, or I guess loop us in a little bit on kind of what you worked on through this process as well.
So I had reached out to CSCU. One of their communications people had responded back to me, Samantha Norton, and I had put in a bunch of questions for her, and I kind of got some, kind of canned PR-ish responses. But the one thing I will say that was pretty valuable was she had kind of pointed me in the direction of some of the statutes that showed why professors, at least, ostensibly speaking, I'm not a lawyer, perhaps there are ways around this, but kind of the statutory reason why these professors do not get their pensions pulled away. So that was interesting. As for on the record speaking about the process, I'm not sure if you're referring to it was, I believe, SCSU's president. That was actually, I had pulled that from previous reporting where she was frustrated at the time trying to get Delventhal and the other professor, the two theater professors,
I believe, right?
yes, Pearlstein removed. And yeah, she went on the record and said, look, we've been trying to get these people fired and it's been really frustrating. And I think that points to the larger problem here is not only, is there some sort of statutory protection that would prevent these professors from getting their pensions pulled or really prevent public employees in general. It makes it very tough for them to get their pensions pulled. You basically have to commit straight up fraud slash embezzlement, which, doesn't really apply in these instances. It was the union protection. That was the big, whoa for me. Just reading through the union agreements, and there's two big unions that are kind of, there were several unions mentioned throughout the documents, but when you're talking about professors in particular, it was really only two, and that was the Four Cs, which was like the community college union, and that's particular here to Connecticut. And then there's AAUP, which is a nationwide one. I could not get an exact number on the membership, but it's across the country. It's over 500 colleges. I believe UConn, if we ever get anything back from them, they fall privy under AAUP as well. And just seeing the contractual agreements that they've had with the states, I mean, it was you could get away with murder essentially as a college professor, and there's not much that the administrators can do about it because they're privy to the terms of these agreements, and it outlines the entire disciplinary process. Each of them has like 3 or 4 different safety levers for, a staff member where if a ruling is made, oh, that doesn't have to be final. We can appeal that. And then from there, it can be brought before this panel and then be brought before arbitrators. And it kind of just, you know, you start to understand why there is such little punishment, or at least a dissatisfactory amount of punishment that is doled out to these professors. Because if you're a school administrator, it's like, been trying to get this guy fired for 3 months now, and it's costing me time, it's costing me money, it's just a massive headache. So you see all of these, a lot of them end in stipulated agreements, which, you'll look through the documentation and you'll see the original punishment that's doled out, and then you'll look at the stipulated agreement that comes down the road weeks, maybe months later, and it's like not even half of that discipline has been baked into that. So I think those are the two things that really stood out to me about why professors, the discipline isn't where the public or any reasonable person probably thinks it should be.
Right.
And
It
something
also,
else to point out here too, as Brandon mentioned, union contracts. The issues we had with this investigation are not only FOIA. There was at least one case where we were told we could not get disciplinary documents because basically the union contract protected them and preempted FOIA in that case. So again, shielding what's going on here, not only, for accountability for this person, but also from any sort of public scrutiny too.
there were a couple different angles, and I know obviously because we're talking about transparency, probably we lay some of this right at the feet of the people who are supposed to be giving us the documents. But I think it's worth acknowledging that the administration does, to Brandon's point, have their hands tied, right? They're bound by these contracts. Then uh, we have a whole section in this investigation called Second Chances, which basically lays out how there's a warning process, right? I mean, Brandon, I don't know if you could speak to this a little bit more, but they could not or chose not to directly jump into those uh, accountability processes. Sometimes they kind of said, "Oh, take that second chance, please don't." Like almost like they were trying to avoid having to get into this bureaucratic process. Is that a fair characterization of kind of the way that they seem to have to approach that?
Um, Maybe that's part of it. I think that for the most part, with the second chance agreements we saw, and that's what they're called, it's essentially like how I'd mentioned the stipulated agreements before. This is a stipulated agreement where you don't don't lose your job. This is a stipulated agreement you get before you get your stipulated agreement telling you, yeah, you've lost your job, but here, keep your money and we won't say anything about it. I think those were particularly in instances where it's like, less, I don't want to say less serious, because I'm sure, some students, if you're getting reported, you've clearly upset people. And if you have a bunch of students to corroborate it, you're probably doing some things wrong. But the two instances that stick up to me, Professor Kunko, and then there's another one, Professor Donna Nicholson, it was more so just kind of, you're bad at your job. I don't want I don't want to, pass on judgment myself, but reading through those claims, it's not that, these people were not having sexual relations with their students. They weren't stalking students. It was more so they made poor decisions in their teaching style, maybe poor management of their class and their coursework, poor communication with the school officials, and said things that upset students, made poor comments or terrible analogies, or talked about golden showers or hemorrhoids in class, all sorts of strange decisions that kind of add up into like, okay, should this person be working here?
And then didn't seem to care about if those things upset their students or were not conducive to a
Yeah,
good learning
yeah,
environment either.
absolutely. Yeah, so there was, I will say, perhaps the one caveat to that was, well, actually, it's hard to say with one of the professors was kind of like an adjunct professor, to my understanding, And so he was on like a 1 year per 1 year contract, and it was unclear why some of the decisions were made in his process, because we just didn't really get, I don't think we got the documentation, or perhaps there wasn't even privy to the FOIA, like, trying to think about the administrator's decisions. But his was actually kind of bad. It was sort of stalkerish behavior of a student talking about sexual things. And at first we saw the school told him, look, we're not renewing your contract. And then the next thing we know, we got a letter saying, actually, we are renewing your contract. And it was interesting because the letter saying that they weren't going to renew him was given to him before his investigation came out, which actually substantiated the claims against him, saying basically you've been creeping out this student that is under your purview. So that was one that is an actual head scratcher where it's like, okay, not quite sure what we're doing here. I think it is notable, though, that he did have within his investigation files, he did have a few coworkers to vouch for how he was as a professor, so maybe that played into it. But yeah, we certainly did see, honestly, more cases than not where professors, even if they didn't sign second chance agreements, they in effect got second chances.
Right.
But that is one of the other things that really jumped out at me is when you're looking through these files, I mean, the investigators, they do a very thorough job. Like the investigations are done pretty thoroughly. The majority of them, they interview tens of witnesses. I remember in one of them, they pulled security camera footage. They talked to employers, the managers, direct managers or administrators of the professors in question or staff members in question. And so I really wish that we could, I wonder how those people feel where it's like you put in all this effort into putting forth kind of the most thorough investigation that you can. And, I wonder how they feel as far as discipline goes. Like, are they satisfied with the results of all the work that they put into these investigations? I would wager probably a lot of times they aren't.
You mentioned too just the fact that obviously one individual is still on the payroll, but there is a not insignificant financial element to this, which I think we would be remiss if we didn't talk about here. And generally, what we're talking about in terms of impact right now is that 5 of the CSCU staff identified for sexual impropriety have received pension payments totaling more than $500,000 since 2019. So, over $500,000. And I think, Catherine, you pulled together these numbers, so you'll be able to speak to this, but that number is going to grow. This is not the end. This isn't like, oh, thank God we wrote the check, we can put it behind us. This is just the beginning of the snowball, right?
Yeah, correct. Right. The majority of these people retired vested in their pensions. So even though there are conclusions from these universities that they were credibly accused of sexual misconduct and are essentially, guilty, maybe not in a legal sense, they're still qualified to collect public pensions. So that number is just going to continue to grow in the coming years. And we investigated a little bit in the investigation where, as a public employee, the conditions to lose your pension are incredibly high. I believe, as our colleague Mark pointed out, you could essentially murder somebody and still collect your public pension because of the statutes that are in place. And, that's certainly not the only cost here. If you read a lot of the findings and, these are just numbers that are much harder to quantify. A lot of these reports come to the conclusion that the individual who's accused, has been credibly accused and is essentially guilty of what the students are charging them with. And the conclusion is not only that that individual needs to go through training for violating university codes of ethics and other things, but that their whole department does too. And, obviously there are costs associated with running those trainings, the amount of time that these employees now have to take away from actually teaching or doing the other parts of their jobs as university faculty, and now are instead spending time on doing these trainings. So, that is a much that there's no good public data on those numbers. Obviously, we can go online and look at what people are being paid out for their pensions, but that's far from the only cost. So the actual number of what this costs Connecticut taxpayers is probably considerably greater than what we're actually able to quantify.
You both wrote and have talked about how this is very clearly a problem. I mean, we had to name the darn thing partial record because we weren't getting the records we need. But more importantly, the greater issue is that this is kids being hurt. I have received several phone calls from legislators and folks who work in this area, and without sharing, on the record quotes, this is, background conversations. They said that there isn't currently a political will to make change, especially, the most simple one being the financial element, right? Everyone who pays taxes in Connecticut is on the hook for continuing to pay these pensions, for paying all of these different process costs. And legislators apparently don't feel that citizens care enough to enact change, which I thought was interesting. And, I'll just kind of leave that as an open thread because uh, I don't necessarily think that the lack of transparency is unrelated to that. There needs to, we obviously, our mission, what we work on every single day is eradicating corruption through investigative journalism. And the most important folks who we partner with are those who are similarly committed to transparency and the other elements that allow us to do that job well. Both citizens, advocates, legislators all over the place. I think this is a unifying mission. At least I'd like to think so. If you're pro-corruption, reach out and make an argument, but I don't know that it will be well received. I'd be very curious to find out what those arguments are. Um, and I want to address just one more thing, which is, Brandon, you said, hopefully we get documents from UConn. And I think that it's worth saying we are entitled to those documents from UConn, and we will pursue those in the exact same way that we will pursue those from CSCU and from the Coast Guard Academy, and in every place where we can put a light on the places where bad things are happening, where corruption is occurring. We are tireless on this, and we will get those documents. So please, watchers, listeners, readers, expect more on this because I have the sneaking suspicion, not that this is the tip of the iceberg, but that there's still a lot of stuff underwater that needs to come to the surface. Before we wrap up, Brandon, Catherine, any last words, anything else that you have to address here?
Yeah, I think just to address, kind of the lack of potential legislative will here. I think another one of the limitations of this investigation is this is only reports on faculty members made by students. We've covered before, and that is addressed in it, how there are potentially other cases that wouldn't be captured by this FOIA for people who fall outside of that category, for partners who are victims of intimate partner violence. That's a bill that's come up multiple years in the legislature. It's up again this year. I don't know if it'll go anywhere. It hasn't gone anywhere before, but again, kind of seems to speak to that issue of there not being a lot of legislative will to deal with this, even though like we have documented cases and we're not the only ones who have reported on this. That this is an issue, and that, people who are adjacent to university faculty or students who are not, directly employed by the university could be victims here, but there is no process for them to go through in the university to report this stuff and for there to be accountability for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that point. Brandon, anything else before we wrap up here?
I will say just one aside. We did actually have one uh, one for sure instance of it. There was we did get a faculty on faculty incident in here. So it wasn't just the faculty on students. But other than that, I think Catherine kind of wraps it up very well. I mean, I don't know how you look at all of this and say, I guess it's, a matter of speaking, perhaps you're right. This is not the most pressing issue on people's minds, but I think if anybody reads this story, I think everybody would agree that clearly something is very wrong here. Probably a few things are very wrong here, whether it's the laws regarding when or when not a state employee can get his pension taken away, whether it's you know, I don't know what gun is being held to the state's head in some of the terms of these bargaining agreements where, you can abandon your class for 3 months, and as long as you return on the 90th day, you're still entitled to your job, or, just some of the things in these contractual agreements. I definitely think that I don't know. That's like a puzzling statement to me. I certainly think that if you look at everything that we've presented, most people would agree that there are several things that would need to change here at the state level. So I guess really it's on legislators and on the public too. If you read this and these things outrage you, then it's the public's job to let legislators know. But I'll be very surprised if, a lack of public interest or a lack of legislative will, whether that remains a constant or not. Yeah, that'll be an interesting thing to see.
It's eyebrow raising stuff. And thank you both for your dedication to transparency. And, like you said, a lot of it is perhaps just not awareness, which is part of what we're here to do, right? Shine that spotlight, make sure that you are aware of it. There's only so much we can do as journalists, but putting out good, solid content that you can rely on to be accurate and fair and trustworthy. That's our goal, right? That's what we want to put out every single day, every single week, just constantly. That's what we are building toward, and that's what our commitment is to the public. Thank you to all of you who watch, listen, tune in, pay attention on CT Politics TV, on the radio, on YouTube. This is available in video too, in various places. So please check it out. Let us know how we can be better. We love receiving feedback. We love our growing army of donors who keep us living and thriving here at Inside Investigator. We will be back in 2 weeks. And until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.